She's a child of darkness, the elders said, their voices heavy with superstition. Her mother's life was the price for her arrival. And so, from her very first breath, Mma was feared, rejected, and shunned by the people she would come to call her own. In the days long ago, in a village called Obosi, where the land is fertile and the rivers are clean, there lived a great maiden called Mma, who was raised by mad people. On the night Mma was born, the village lay under a blanket of unsettling silence. The moon, usually a gentle guardian of the night, hid its face behind thick animous clouds. Shadows stretched long and airy, and the cries of owls echoed through the dense forest, their haunting calls like whispers of a warning no one wanted to hear. Her birth was marked by tragedy. As her mother took her final breath, the villagers whispered among themselves, their faces edged with fear. An evil child, they murmured, pointing at the newborn, her cries sharp and piercing. She has come to bring ruin in this village, where every sign and omen held deep meaning. The night of Mma's birth could not have been more ominous. To be born on such a night, with the moon shrouded and the owls in mourning, was a bad sign, an unforgiving one. It wasn't long before the rumors spread like wildfire, and Mma was marked as the one who brought misfortune. She's a child of darkness, the elders said, their voices heavy with superstition. Her mother's life was the price for her arrival. And so, from her very first breath, Mma was feared, rejected, and shunned by the people she would come to call her own. The village's fear grew with each passing day, the whispers of Mma's dark destiny spreading like poison through their hearts. They feared that if she stayed, she would bring famine, disease, or worse, death to them all. The pressure mounted on her father, Ifani, who was already a broken man after losing his beloved wife. The villagers, with eyes clouded by superstition, gathered before his home one evening. Their torches flickered like angry spirits in the wind, and their voices blended into one threatening chorus. Take the child to the evil forest, Ifeanyi, or you will suffer with her. No one will trade with you, no one will greet you, and your family's name will be cursed for generations. Ifeanyi, a man once known for his courage, now trembled under the weight of the villagers' judgment. The words of the elders rang in his ears, reminding him of the prophecy foretold about Umma. She will be the end of us all, they had said, and in his heart, fear began to root deeper than his love for the child who had caused his wife's death. In the dead of night, when the stars blinked like distant, uncaring eyes, Ifeanyi made his decision. His hands shook as he carried Mma, swaddled in a tattered cloth, to the edge of the evil forest. This was a place feared by all, where no one ventured willingly. It was said that spirits of the restless dead roamed its depths, and that those taken there were never seen again. The villagers followed him at a distance, their silent presence a reminder of what would happen if he refused. Ifeanyi stood at the entrance of the forest, his feet rooted in hesitation. For a brief moment, he looked down at Mma, her small face peaceful, unaware of the doom that surrounded her life. A tear slid down his cheek as he whispered, "Forgive me, my daughter." With a heavy heart, he placed her on the ground, just inside the forest's dark embrace. The wind howled through the trees as if the forest itself acknowledged the arrival of its new inhabitant. Ifeanyi turned away quickly, unable to watch, and the villagers followed suit, their backs turned to the child they had abandoned to the spirit they believed had sent her. As the village retreated, the forest seemed to swallow Mma whole, the trees swaying like dark sentinels guarding their new world. Left alone in the wilderness, surrounded by the unknown, Mma's fate now lay in the hands of the very forces the villagers feared. The villagers quickened their pace, their fear palpable in the hurried shuffle of their feet. The wind, which had been a mere whisper when Ifeanyi entered the forest, now howled through the trees with the force of a storm. It lashed at their backs like a whip, urging them away from the place they feared. The villagers felt the wind's bite and shuddered, unsure whether it was a protest against what they had done, or perhaps a welcome, a cold embrace from the wilderness for the child they had cast out. No one dared to look back. They moved with increasingly speed, as if by running they could distance themselves from the guilt they would not admit to feeling. Ifeanyi, consumed by fear and guilt, kept his eyes forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the faint cries of his newborn daughter, carried on the wind and ignored at his soul. But the villagers, now utterly convinced of Mma's supposed evil, continued to whisper prayers and superstitious incantations as they made their way home. Once back in the village, doors slammed shut, and the people locked themselves inside their homes. Each family huddled together, waiting for the dawn to wash away their fear, hoping that Mma's cries would disappear into the night. But while they fled in terror, someone else heard those cries, not with fear, but with compassion. In a lonely hut on the outskirts of the village, a woman named Ijoma awoke, the one the villagers called mad. She was once beautiful and full of promise, but years of tragedy and isolation had left her an outcast. The people of the village said she was cursed, her mind unfit for their company, for she often spoke in riddles and wandered aimlessly near the forest, her eyes distant, as though seeing something no one else could. On this night, Ijoma stared not because of the wind, but because of the unmistakable sound of a baby crying. It pierced the night, a sharp, plaintive wail, cutting through the rush of the wind and reaching her like a plea. The villagers had it too, but where they had a curse, Ijoma had only a child in need. Drawn by the pitiful sound, Ijoma rose from her mat, her movements quick yet graceful, her tattered garment hanging loosely from her thin frame. The wind seemed to push her forward as if guiding her steps. She moved with purpose, her bare feet soundless, padded softly across the earth as she moved towards the edge of the forest. No one saw her leave her hut. No one saw her cross the village. There was no fear in her heart, only curiosity and something that had long been buried within her, a deep, instinctive need to protect. The forest ahead loomed dark and wild, its trees twisted and knotted like ancient sentinels. Most people feared the forest because of spirits and the strange occurrences that sometimes took place within its depths. Many who entered never returned, and it was whispered that the forest held secrets, deep and old, that no man or woman should disturb. But Ijoma did not hesitate. Her sharp mind, often misunderstood by the villagers, now worked with calm precision. She had always felt a strange connection to the natural world, an understanding that others dismissed as madness. She knew the forest like an old friend, its paths, its dangers, and its hidden places. And tonight, it was calling to her, though not with fear, but with purpose. And she stepped into the underbrush. The wind suddenly died down, as though the forest itself had stilled to listen. The cries grew louder now, more desperate, and Ijoma quickened her pace, weaving through the trees with practiced ease. The wind whispered secrets to her as she walked, and she nodded, as if in conversation with unseen guides. Step by step, she made her way deeper into the forest until finally she found the source of the cries. An infant, lying on the cold ground, wrapped in the thin clothes that had already begun to loosen. Mma's tiny face was red from crying, her small fists clenched in distress. How can such innocence and beauty be called evil? Ijoma wondered. To her, she was not an evil omen. She was a child, abandoned and helpless, left to the mercy of the elements. The wind stilled as Ijoma knelt beside Mma, her once crazed eyes now calm and focused. She knelt there for a moment, her gaze softening as she reached out to touch the child's cheek. Ah, little one, she murmured softly. They do not understand, right? Don't you worry now. I am here for you. Hush now, little one, Ijoma whispered, her voice soft and soothing. You were not meant to bring harm. You are not what they say. The trees rustled softly around them, as if agreeing with Ijoma's words. There was no hesitation in her movement as she reached down and gently gathered the infant into her arms, cradling the child against her chest with a tenderness that had never been seen in the mad woman. The baby's cries quieted almost immediately, as though sensing the warmth and safety of this strange woman's embrace. Ijoma smiled, her heart swelling with something she had never felt before, a fierce, protective love. She stood, holding Mma close to her chest, and turned back towards the depth of the forest, away from the village that had forsaken them both. Back at her small hut, Ijoma laid Mma down on a woven mat near the fire. She studied the child's face, her fingers brushing the baby's cheek. The villagers had thrown her away, but Ijoma saw something different in Mma. Not a curse, not an omen, just a child abandoned and alone. They are afraid of what they do not understand, Ijoma whispered, but I understand you. And so, while the village slept in fear, praying for dawn to erase the memory of the child they had cast away, Ijoma sat awake, watching over Mma with quiet determination. She knew that this child's fate was not sealed by superstition. Whatever future Mma held, it would not be decided by the villagers' fear. Mma found a mother, companion, and friend in Ijoma, the woman who had saved her as an infant, and in the other outcasts who lived on the fringe of the village. This strange and fragmented community welcomed her in a ways the villagers never had. They taught her the skills to survive, to navigate the mysteries of the forest, and they showed her kindness in their own peculiar ways. But despite the warmth they offered, Mma often felt a deep sense of loneliness among them. Each of the outcasts had their own burdens to bear, their own histories that had left them lost in words only they could understand. Ijeoma, though fiercely protective and loving, would sometimes retreat into her own thoughts, her mind wandering far from Mma's reach. Others would speak in riddles, mumble to unseen companions, or fall into long silences where Mma's presence seemed distant to them, as if they had forgotten she was even there. Mma often tried to penetrate into their worlds, to understand the way they saw things, but she could never quite grasp it. The invisible walls of their thoughts kept her out, no matter how hard she tried to break through. And so, despite their companionship, there were moments when Mma felt alone, surrounded by people, yet unable to truly connect. It was in this moment of isolation that her yearning for something more began to grow. As she grew older, Mma would sit on the edges of their gatherings, watching Ijeoma busy with nothing, or the others stare blankly into the flames of the fire, lost in their own thoughts. She would listen to their disjointed conversations, half sentences that seemed to trail off into the air. It was then that the forest, once so full of life and safety, began to feel small and confining. She longed for a connection that was deeper, a world where she could belong completely, not just on the surface. She craved conversations that didn't end in confusion or silence, relationships that didn't drift away into the distant corners of someone's mind. The village beyond the forest, the place that had once cast her aside, began to intrigue her. From the stories Ijoma told, Mma knew that it was a world different from her own, a world where people laughed together, worked together, and shared a kind of bond she had never truly known. The thought of it lingered in her mind, a mystery she couldn't let go of. The older Mma grew, the more her curiosity deepened. She watched from the shadows when villagers ventured close to the forest to gather firewood or fetch water. Their clothes, their gestures, their laughter, it all seemed so foreign to her, yet so alluring. She wondered what their lives were like. Did they sit around fires and share stories like she did with Ijoma and the others? Or did they talk of other things, things that made sense to them but were beyond Mma's understanding? The more she watched, the more she felt the pull. There was a world outside the forest, one that seemed clearer, more focused, and she yearned to be a part of it. Though she loved Ijoma and her unusual family of outcasts, the invisible distance between them became harder to ignore. The more Mma tried to hold on to their attention, the more it slipped through her fingers, like smoke in the wind. And with that, the loneliness grew sharper, and the pull towards the village grew stronger. She wanted to understand, to know what life was like beyond the trees. She wanted more. In her quest for more, she began to venture further and further away from the depths of the forest, seeking for what she couldn't explain. Mma's restlessness had grown with each passing day. The forest, once her safe haven, now felt like a cage. Though she loved Ijoma and the others, her curiosity about the world beyond the trees burned too brightly to ignore. Each time she ventured closer to the edges of the forest, she found herself hoping to catch a glimpse of the villagers, the people whose lives seemed so different from her own. There was something out there, something she needed to understand, though she couldn't yet explain what it was. On one such day, as the sun hung low in the sky and the air hummed with the sounds of the forest, Mma ventured further than she ever had before. The familiar paths she knew so well faded into wild undergrowth as she pushed deeper towards the village's farmland. Her heart raced with excitement and anticipation, even though she wasn't sure what she was searching for. All she knew was that there was a pool, something beyond the trees that she needed to find. Suddenly, a sharp cry pierced the stillness of the air. Mma froze, her senses on high alert. Ahead, through a thicket of bushes, she saw movement. Her keen eyes quickly caught sight of a man, and her heart leaped. A villager. He was dressed in the simple clothing she had often seen from afar, but his face was twisted in terror. His arms flayed as he struggled against something, a wild pig. The creature was massive, its tusks gleaming dangerously as it charged at him, its guttural growls filling the air. The man stumbled back, his fear palpable, barely able to defend himself. Mma, having lived her entire life in the wilderness, knew the threat well. She had encountered wild pigs before and had learned how to fend them off. Lessons that had been taught to her by the outcasts, who had survived the dangers of the forest for years. Without hesitation, Mma moved into action. Her limbs were swift and sure as she darted towards the scene, picking up a long, sturdy branch as she ran. She let out a loud, sharp cry, the kind that echoed through the forest and startled even the fiercest of animals. The wild pig turned its head, distracted by the sudden noise. Taking advantage of the moment, Mma circled around it, waving the branch in front of its face, jabbing the air to keep it at bay. The pig hesitated, confused by her sudden appearance and the aggressive gestures. Slowly, it backed off, its snarls turning into grunts as it lost interest in the man and eventually retreated into the underbush. Breathing heavily, Mma lowered her branch and turned to look at the man she had saved. He was crouched behind a large tree, his face a mask of terror, his eyes wide with fear. For a brief moment, Mma felt a surge of triumph and joy. She had done it. She had saved him. And now, standing before her, was one of the people she had been so curious about for so long. Her heart swelled with excitement. She took a slow step towards him, her hand outstretched, wanting to touch him, to confirm if he felt the same like Ijoma and the rest of her family. Her mind raced with questions. What was his life like? Did he feel the same fears and longings she did? Could this be the connection she had been seeking all along? But as she reached out, the man's eyes filled with panic. His expression twisted from fear into something darker, something she couldn't quite understand. He grabbed a stick from the ground and swung it at her with trembling hands. Mma stumbled back, confused. No, wait! She cried, her voice soft but urgent. She didn't understand why he was hitting her. She wasn't a wild pig. She wasn't the threat. She had saved him. Why was he so afraid? But the man's fear had already overtaken him. His eyes were wide, his breath coming into short, sharp gaps. To him, Mma was no savior. She was something unknown and terrifying. She was one of the spirits from the forest, the ones whispered about in old village tales, the ones they called cursed. In his panic, he couldn't see her for who she really was. He only saw danger. He swung the stick again, this time striking her arm. The sharp sting of the blow sent a jolt of pain through Mma's body. She cried out, staggering back, clutching her arm. Please, she begged, tears welling in her eyes. I'm not here to hurt you.
but the man didn't stop. His face was twisted with terror, his movement frantic. He swung again, this time hitting her leg. Anama felt her knees buckle beneath her. Desperation flooded her mind as she realized that if she didn't escape, he might beat her to death. With one final look at the man, the one she had so desperately wanted to understand, Mma turned and fled. She ran back into the forest, her body bruised and her heart aching. The thick undergrowth clawed at her skin, but she didn't stop. She ran and ran until the trees swallowed her whole once more. Her breath ragged, her mind racing. When she finally collapsed against a tree, far from where the man could reach her, tears streamed down her face. She didn't understand. She had saved him. Why had he attacked her? What had she done to deserve such fear and hatred? She wasn't the evil child they had once feared. She was just Mma, a child of the forest, a child who just wanted to belong. She hugged her knees to her chest. The pain from her wounds, nothing compared to the deeper ache in her soul. The rejection cut deeper than any blow from the stick. All her life, she had yearned for a connection with the people beyond the trees. She had dreamed of understanding them, of being part of their world. But now she realized, with a sinking feeling, that they might never see her as anything but a monster from the forest. Why? She whispered into the wind, her voice choked with sobs. Why do they hate me? The forest around her was silent, offering no answers. And in that silence, Mma felt more alone than ever. But an idea came to her then and she looked up in excitement. Is it possible that it was only the crazy man? She pondered as hope began to rise in her heart again. She had only met one, so why would she use that to conclude on everyone? But what if they are all the same, she thought, frightened again. These many thoughts fought for space in her mind as she tried to make sense of her encounter with the strange villager. Meanwhile, Ifeanyi on his part stumbled through the path leading back to the village, his chest still heavy from the adrenaline of the encounter. His legs were weak, his body sore from the frantic struggle with the wild pig, and his mind was a wail of confusion and guilt. He clutched the stick he had used to strike the white creature, his hands trembling slightly. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the image of the white figure who had saved him. It had all happened in a blur. One moment, he had been certain that the white pig would kill him, its stalks flashing in the dim light as it charged at him. And then she appeared. A human, yes, but barely recognizable as one. She had come out of the forest like a creature born of its shadow, fierce, primal, and terrifying in her appearance. Her hair was matted with leaves and dirt, her skin streaked with mud, her clothes tattered and barely clinging to her body. Her eyes were wide and intense, shining with a mixture of determination and something he couldn't place. And the way she had leaped into action with the precision of someone who belonged to the wild, who knew how to handle its dangers. She had moved with an almost inhuman grace, distracting the pig with some sharp cries and swinging a long branch with practiced ease. The animal had retreated, confused by her sudden appearance, and eventually shrunk back into the undergrowth, leaving Ifani shaking but alive. But it wasn't just the wild pig that had unnerved him, it was her. The way she had turned to him afterward, her eyes glinting with something he could recognize now as almost childlike curiosity, as if she had been as fascinated by him as he had been terrified of her. But his terror didn't give him a chance to see her as maybe a human. All he could think at that moment was that she was a wild creature, half human, half something else. But as she had stepped towards him, her hand outstretched as if wanting to touch him, to connect somehow, his fears had gotten the better of him. And in his panic, he had seen her not as a savior, but as something monstrous, something born of the forest's darkest corners. Her wild appearance, her tangled hair, her gowned frame, her ragged clothes had filled him with dread. She looked less like a person and more like one of the mad people who wandered near the village, the ones everyone whispered about and avoided at all costs. There had been something unsettling about the way the creature moved, the way it looked at him with such familiarity, like she knew him. And in his panic, he had beaten her as if she were some kind of monster sent to finish what the pig had started. Even when she had recoiled, her expression shifted from curiosity to confusion. He couldn't stop. He had struck her again, harder this time. The fear in his chest had driven him into a frenzy and he kept swinging until she finally turned and ran, disappearing back into the forest from which she had come. Now, as Ifani made his way back to the village, the guilt gnawed at him. He had been saved, yet instead of gratitude, he had repaid his savior with violence. And the strange thing was, there had been something about her, something in the way she looked at him, the way she moved, that stirred memories long buried. Ifani shook his head as he reached his home, pushing the door open with a tired sigh. The fire in his small heart had long since gone out, and the silence in his home only deepened the sense of emptiness he carried with him. He sank onto a stool, his mind reeling, drifting to memories he had long tried to bury, memories of a night shrouded in fear and sorrow. He couldn't forget the way she had looked at him. There had been something almost human in her eyes, despite her wide appearance. But more than that, she had reminded him of a time long ago, the night his daughter, someone, was born under a moonless sky, with owls crying in the trees. His daughter, Mma, the night he had given in to the pressure of the villagers and left his newborn baby in the evil forest, convinced that she was a curse, a harbinger of doom. The thought struck him like a blow. He hadn't thought about Mma in a long time. It was too painful, the guilt too overwhelming. But now, sitting in the quiet of his home, the memory of her came rushing back. The daughter he had left to die in the evil forest so many years ago. The daughter who had been born under the shadow of superstition. The child he had abandoned out of fear. The villagers had convinced him that she was cursed, that her birth had brought evil upon them. They had pressured him, filled his mind with dread, until he had given in and carried her into the forest, leaving her behind like some unwanted thing. The guilt had never truly left him, but he had never spoken of it. He never admitted, even to himself, how much it still haunted him. He had carried it with him for years, like a stone in his chest, heavy and immovable. He remembered the moment he placed her on the ground, her tiny face barely visible in the darkness, and the wind that had howled through the trees as if protesting what he had done. He had walked away that night, but his heart had never stopped whispering the question that haunted him still. What if I was wrong? And now, today, after all these years, he had been saved by a white creature, one of the forest people. Surely, yet, she had reminded him so much of the daughter he had lost. Her tangled hair, her intense eyes, the way she had moved with such surety in the wild. It was as if Mma had somehow survived, had grown up among the outcast, among the mad, turning into something wild and strange. But no, that couldn't be. Mma had been a baby, a helpless child, She couldn't have survived the forest, not on her own. The figure that had saved him today must have been one of the others, one of the mad people who lived on the outskirts of the village, the ones everyone feared. They were strange, disconnected from the world, living in their own realities. They wandered near the forest, and people told stories about them, stories of their madness and their unnatural ways. Perhaps this wild girl was one of them. Yet, despite her threatening appearance, despite the way she had unnerved him, there had been a connection, a feeling that Ifani couldn't shake. She had saved his life. She had looked at him with recognition, with something almost like affection. But why? Why had she risked herself to protect him? And why did she remind him so much of Mma? Ifani's heart ached with the weight of his guilt. He couldn't help but wonder, as he often did, what might have happened if he had made a different choice all those years ago. What if he had kept his daughter, had defied the villagers and raised her himself? Would she have grown into a beautiful, kind woman? Would she have lived a life full of joy instead of being cast away? But he had chosen fear. He had left her to die in the evil forest. And now, the thought that this wild, strange girl had saved him only deepened the wound in his soul. Perhaps it was the universe's way of reminding him of the life he had abandoned, of the daughter he had lost. He stood, pacing the floor of his small home, unable to sit still as the gravity of his guilt washed over him. The faces of the villagers, the ones who had pressured him into abandoning Mma, flashed before his eyes. But now, their voices, their warnings, felt hollow and distant. They had convinced him that Mma was cursed, that her birth had brought evil upon them. But standing here now, with the memories of the wild figure fresh in his mind, Ifani realized that he had been wrong about a lot of things. He had always been wrong. A part of him wanted to run back into the forest to find the creature, no, the girl who had saved him. Shaking his head, Ifani stood still and gazed out of the small window of his hut. The forest loomed in the distance, dark and impenetrable, holding its secret close. He couldn't go back, not to the forest, not to the past. But the strange girl from today, the one who had saved him, her image stayed with him, haunting him. She had reminded him of Mma, and that was a pain he wasn't sure he could bear. Mma had finally stood up from her crouched position and ran deep into the forest, her heart pounding in her chest, her body aching from the blows she had received. She didn't stop until she reached the familiar clearing near Ijoma's hut, where the sounds of the village couldn't reach her, and the safety of the trees wrapped around her like a protective cocoon. She collapsed onto the ground, her breath coming in sharp, red gasps, and for a long while she simply lay there, staring up at the canopy of leaves above her, her thoughts still in chaos. But why? Mma pondered as she sat up slowly, wiping the dirt from her face with trembling hands. She didn't understand. She had saved him. She had risked her life to fend off the wild pig that was about to kill him. And yet, when she reached out to him, when she tried to connect with him, he had lashed out. Her mind swelled with questions, her heart heavy with confusion. Why did the villagers see her as something to fear? Was it because of the way she looked? Her wild hair, her ragged clothes? Was that what made them hate her? She curled her arms around her knees, pulling them close to her chest, and for the first time in a long while, Mma felt the full weight of her isolation. She had always been different from Ijoma and the others, always curious about the world beyond the forest. But now, after what had happened, she wasn't sure if she would ever be able to understand them. The man hadn't seen her as a person, he had seen her as something else, something less. For the first time, Mma wondered if she had been wrong all along. She had spent so many years dreaming of the village, imagining what life must be like beyond the trees. But now that she had met one of them up close, she wasn't sure if she belonged there. Maybe Ijoma had been right all along. The villagers didn't understand her, and they never would. Still, something in Mma's heart ached. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to them than fear. The man had been terrified, yes, but there had been something else in his eyes too. Something that tugged at Mma's curiosity once more. He had looked at her like he knew her, like he had seen something familiar in her face. And despite everything, despite the pain and the fear, Mma couldn't help but wonder why. As she sat in the clearing, nursing her bruises, she felt the old pull return. She still wanted to understand. She still wanted to know what lay beyond the forest. But now, that curiosity was tinged with caution. The villagers might never accept her, but maybe, just maybe, she could find out why they were so afraid. The village was waiting, and so were her questions. She wasn't done yet. Back in the village, it's been some days, and the encounter Ifani had in the forest continued to trouble him. One evening, Ifani sat in his small hut, the fire now burning low in the hearth. His mind hadn't stopped racing from the encounter in the forest. The wild figure, the woman, or was it a girl, still haunted him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face. The way she had looked at him with curiosity and a strange unspoken recognition. He couldn't understand why she had reminded him of Umma, and yet the thought wouldn't leave him alone. But it wasn't just her resemblance to his daughter that troubled him, it was what she represented. For years, Ifani, like the rest of the village, had feared the outcasts. The people who lived on the outskirts of the village were seen as mad, dangerous, and cursed. They were said to be touched by the evil spirit of the forest, and no one dared to go near them. The villagers whispered about them in hushed tones, telling stories of their madness and the strange wild ways they lived. Ifani had believed those stories. He had believed that the forest outcasts were something to be feared, something to stay far away from. But now, he wasn't sure. That wild woman had saved his life. She had risked herself to fight off the wild pig without hesitation. And after everything, she hadn't attacked him. She had only tried to reach out, to touch him, as if she was just as curious about him as he was frightened of her. If she had been dangerous, if she had been one of the mad people he had always feared, why had she acted with such kindness? As Ifani sat alone, the weight of his past decisions pressed heavily on him. He thought about Uma, the daughter he had left to die in the evil forest, and his heart ached with guilt. The villagers had convinced him that she was a curse, a harbinger of evil. But now, after what had happened in the forest, he began to wonder if he had been wrong. Maybe the villagers had been wrong about the outcasts too. The forest had always been a place of fear for the villagers, a place where danger lurked, both physical and supernatural. But what if the outcasts weren't cursed? What if they were simply different, misunderstood? Ifeanyi leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as his thoughts spiraled. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing. The world he had always known, the beliefs he had clung to, were starting to unravel. He had spent his entire life avoiding the outcasts, fearing them, just like the rest of the village. But now, He wasn't sure if he would continue to live that way. The wild girl, whoever she was, had saved him, and he couldn't ignore that. For the first time in years, Ifani felt something shift in his heart. The fear he had always carried, the fear of the forest and its people, began to loosen its grip. He didn't know what to make of the girl from the forest, but he knew one thing for certain: she had been kind to him, and that kindness was real, no matter how wild or strange she appeared. Maybe the outcasts weren't the monsters he had believed them to be. Maybe they were people, just like him, who had been cast aside, misunderstood. But the questions still lingered. Who was she? Why had she saved him? And why did she remind him so much of the daughter he had abandoned? As night fell and the village settled into a quiet slumber, Ifani found no rest. His thoughts were still with the girl in the forest and with the daughter he had lost so long ago. Somehow, he knew that his encounter with the wild woman had changed him. It had stirred something deep within him, something he couldn't yet name. And though he didn't know it yet, the bond between him and the wild girl, the bond he couldn't explain, was far from over. Weeks passed, but neither Mma nor Ifeanyi could shake the memory of their meeting in the forest. For Mma, the sting of rejection had not faded. She had returned to her unusual life among the outcasts, but something inside her had shifted. The forest, once her only home, now felt more confining, more isolating. She found herself watching the edge of the trees with a new weariness, no longer certain if the world beyond them was one she could ever truly belong to. Yet, despite the pain the encounter had caused her, Mma couldn't stop thinking about the man she had saved. His face haunted her, the fear in his eyes, the way he had struck her even as she tried to help him. And beneath the fear, something else had flickered in his gaze, something she couldn't name. It was as if he had known her, or at least recognized something familiar in her. That thought lingered in Mma's mind, unsettling but also irresistible. Who was he, and why did his fear feel so personal, so deep? She often found herself returning to the same part of the forest where they had met, as if drawn by some invisible thread. She didn't dare venture too close to the village anymore. Her wounds, both physical and emotional, were too fresh, but she couldn't fully let go of the questions that still burned in her mind. Why had he feared her so much? What was it about her that made the villagers look at her as if she were less than human? And why, despite all of this, did she still want to understand them? In the village, Ifani's life had taken on a similar rhythm of unrest. His mind was still consumed by thoughts of the wild girl and by the memories of the daughter he had abandoned so many years ago. He had tried to carry on with his daily tasks, working in the fields, trading at the market, but his heart wasn't in it. No matter how much he tried to push it away, the image of the girl haunted him. The villagers, of course, knew nothing of his encounter. He had kept it to himself, unwilling to face their questions, their superstitions. He had always been a private man, and his guilt over abandoning Mma had long been a burden he carried alone. But now, that guilt weighed heavier than ever. Sometimes, as he walked in the fields or sat quietly in his home, he would catch himself wondering, what if Mma had survived? What if she was like the girl in the forest? One of the mad people, yes, but also someone with the same spirit, the same resilience that his daughter might have had if she had lived. But no matter how much Ifani tried to convince himself that the past was behind him, that Mma had been lost to the forest long ago, the connection between his daughter and the wild girl tugged at him. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that his encounter with her had shifted something deep inside him. He no longer feared the outcast the way he once had.
The villagers still whispered their stories of madness and curses. But Ifani had seen something else in that girl. She had saved him. She had risked her life for his, with no thought of reward or recognition. And that kindness, that bravery, had stayed with him in a way he couldn't explain. The outcast, once feared and rivaled in his eyes, now seemed more like the victims of misunderstanding than the monsters the villagers made them out to be. But what could he do? He was just one man, living under the same traditions and superstition that had shaped the village for generations. How could he alone change the way his people thought? And yet, Ifani knew he couldn't go back to the way things were before. The wild girl had changed him, whether he liked it or not. Mma continued to venture closer to the edges of the forest. Though her heart was still cautious, her wounds had healed, but the memory of the man's blows still stung, not just physically but deep within her soul. She wasn't sure if she was brave or foolish to keep returning, but she felt pulled towards the village in a way she couldn't resist. One afternoon, as she crouched behind a thick tree near the forest's edge, she caught sight of him again, the man from before. He was walking alone, his face drawn in thought. Mma's heart raced as she watched him. She wanted to turn away, to retreat back into the safety of the forest. But something kept her rooted to the spot. As she watched him from the shadows, something strange happened. The man stopped and looked around, as if sensing her presence. His eyes scanned the edge of the forest, and for a moment Mma held her breath, afraid that he had seen her. But instead of fear, his expression softened, and something like sadness flickered across his face. Mma couldn't explain it, but she felt a punch of sympathy for him. He looked lost, just as she felt. Could it be that the man who had hurt her was suffering in his own way? And if so, what was the cause of his pain? She waited until he moved on before she stepped out from her hiding place, her mind buzzing with questions. For the first time, she began to wonder if the villagers weren't so different from her after all. Perhaps they too were afraid of things they didn't understand. For Ifeanyi, his walks near the forest had become a strange ritual. Every day, he found himself drawn back to the place where the encounter with the wild girl had taken place. He didn't know why he kept returning. Part of him hoped to catch another glimpse of her, though the thought of facing her again filled him with guilt and uncertainty. Each time he walked past the forest, he felt the weight of his past pressing down on him, the guilt of abandoning Mma, the regret of the choices he had made. And yet, there was something else now, something like hope. The wild girl had reminded him of Mma. Yes, but she had also shown him that there was kindness in the forest, even among those the villagers feared. The more time passed, the more Ifanyi's fear of the outcast began to dissolve. He still didn't fully understand them, but he no longer believed the old stories of curses and madness. The girl who had saved him was proof that there was more to their lives than the villagers understood. And the more Ifani thought about it, the more he began to question everything he had once believed. One evening, as he sat in his small hut, the firelight casting long shadows on the walls, Ifani made a decision. He could no longer live with the guilt of the past, nor could he continue to ignore the questions that had been gnawing at him since his encounter with the wild girl. He would go to the forest. He would seek her out, not to apologize for what had happened, though that weighed heavily on him, but to understand. He had to know more. He had to know if there was a way to bridge the gap between the village and the forest, between the people who lived in fear and those who had been cast out. And though he could hardly admit it to himself, he needed to know if there was any chance that his daughter, his Mma, had somehow survived. Mma had no idea that the man she had saved was planning to return to the forest, but she felt a strange sense of anticipation in the days that followed, as if something was shifting in the air. She couldn't explain it, but the pull towards the village had grown stronger, despite everything that had happened. And so, one evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the forest in a golden glow, Mma made her way to the edge of the trees once more. This time, though she wasn't just watching, this time she was waiting. For what? She didn't even know. But like the other days, nothing extraordinary happened, so she returned to the forest but sad. Mma's growing restlessness did not go unnoticed. Ijoma had always been able to sense when something was stirring in Mma's heart, even though she lived much of her life in quiet contemplation, often retreating into her own thoughts, lost in her own world, but she was never blind to the girl she had raised. She had seen the way Mma's eyes lingered on the edges of the forest more often, the way she returned from her walks more troubled than before. There was a change in her, a shift that Ijoma recognized all too well. One evening, on one of those rare occasions where everyone or almost everyone in the forest settlement were present in mind and body. As they sat together by the fire, Ijoma finally spoke. You have been quieter lately, she said, her voice soft but steady. Something weighs on you, child. I can see it in your eyes. Mma, who had been staring into the flames, blinked and turned towards Ijoma, shocked that she had been keen enough all this while to notice her turmoil. But she still hesitated, unsure of how to put her feelings into words. The encounter with the man still haunted her, and yet she hadn't spoken of it to anyone, not even Ijoma. Part of her didn't want to admit how much it had affected her, how deeply it had shaken her sense of belonging. I I don't know how to explain it. Mma began, her voice barely above a whisper. I have always wanted to know what the villagers were like. I have always been curious about their world, but now, after what happened, I'm not sure if I belong there at all. Ijoma's eyes softened as she listened, her hands working gently on the basket she was weaving. She had always known that Mma's heart was full of questions, full of longing for something beyond the forest. And though she had tried to shield her from the pain that would inevitably come with that curiosity, she knew this moment was bound to happen. What happened? Ijoma asked, her voice calm but concerned. Mma hesitated again, but then the words began to pour out. She told Ijoma about the day she had saved the man from the wild pig, how she had stepped forward with hope and curiosity, only to be met with fear and violence. She spoke of the blows he had dealt her, the confusion and hurt that had filled her heart, and the questions that had followed her ever since. I just don't understand, Mma said, her voice trembling slightly. Why did he look at me like I was something to fear? Why did he hit me? I was only trying to help. Ijoma sighed, setting her weaving aside and reaching out to gently take Mma's hand. Her touch was warm, comforting, and Mma felt a surge of emotion rise in her chest. Child, Ijoma began softly. The villagers had lived in fear for many generations. They fear the things they don't understand. And you are one of those things. It's not because you have done anything wrong. It's because they have never taken the time to see us for who we really are. Mma looked down at their hands, feeling the familiar ache of loneliness return. But why? Why did they try to understand? Ijoma smiled sadly. Fear blinds people, Mma. It makes them see monsters where there are none. It makes them strike out at the very things that could bring them peace. The villagers had been taught to fear the forest and everything in it. To them, The unknown is dangerous. Mma's brow furrowed as she absorbed Ijoma's words. But I'm not dangerous, she whispered. I just wanted to know them. I just wanted to understand. Ijoma nodded, her gaze thoughtful. I know, child, and perhaps, in time, they will learn to see that too. But you must be careful. Your heart is strong, but not everyone will recognize that. Not everyone will see you as you really are. Mma's throat tightened with emotion. Then, what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to just stay here in the forest forever? Ijoma shook her head gently. No, my child. I know you too well to ask that of you. You have always had the spirit of someone who seeks more, and you are not like us. But I would ask you to be patient. You have seen the villagers up close now. You have seen their fear. Or perhaps, in time, there is a way for them to see past it. And when that time comes, you will know what to do. Mma swallowed hard, her emotions swelling inside her. Ijoma's words, though gentle, were a reminder of the harsh reality she faced. The villagers might never understand her. They might never see her as anything but the wild girl from the forest. And yet, something in her still longed to try, to find some kind of connection with them. Remember, Mma, Ijoma continued, her voice soft but firm. You are more than what they think of you. You are more than the stories they tell. You are strong and you are kind. And one day, those qualities will shine through. But until then, you must guard your heart. Don't let their fear make you forget who you are. Mma nodded slowly, the weight of Ijoma's words settling in her chest. She still felt the pull towards the village, the questions that burned inside her. But she knew that Ijoma was right. She had to be careful. The world beyond the forest was full of fear, and she couldn't afford to be hurt again. Still, even as Ijoma's advice echoed in her mind, Mma couldn't let go of the curiosity that had always driven her. She had seen the man's fear, but she had also seen something else, something that made her believe there was more to the villagers than their fear. I will be careful, Mma promised, her voice steady. But I'm not ready to give up yet. Ijoma smiled, though there was a trace of worry in her eyes. I know, child, I know. The next day, Mma ventured back to the edge of the forest, her heart still heavy, but her mind clearer after her conversation with Ijoma. She had promised to be cautious, to protect herself from the fear and violence of the villagers. But her curiosity remained, and she couldn't resist the pull that brought her back to the same spot where she had met the man. As the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor, Mma crouched behind the familiar tree, her breath steady as she waited. She wasn't sure what she was waiting for, but she felt it, a sense that something was about to change. And then she saw him again, the man from before, walking slowly along the edge of the forest, his steps heavy with thought. Mma's heart raced as she watched him. He seemed different this time, quieter, more contemplative. There was no wild fear in his eyes, no frantic gestures. Instead, he looked around the forest with something like curiosity. Mma hesitated. Should she stay hidden? Or should she try to approach him again, despite the warnings Ijoma had given her? Her heart pounded in her chest as she weighed her options. And then, to her surprise, the man stopped. He turned towards the forest, his eyes scanning the trees, and for a moment, Mma thought he had seen her. But instead of retreating, he took a few cautious steps towards the tree line, his expression softening with a mixture of wonder and uncertainty. Mma's breath caught in her throat. This was different. He wasn't afraid this time. He was curious. For the first time, Mma felt a flicker of hope,
Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to bridge the gap between their worlds. She stayed hidden, her heart beating rapidly as she watched Ifani take slow, deliberate steps towards the edge of the forest. His demeanor was different this time. There was no white panic, no desperation in his movement. He seemed calm, curious, and even as if the fear that had consumed him during their last encounter had loosened its grip. She watched him carefully, unsure of what to do. Ijoma's words echoed in her mind. Guard your heart, be careful. Mma had promised herself she would be cautious, but this time felt different. The man was no longer wielding a stick, nor longer recoiling in terror. There was something softer in his gaze, something that intrigued Mma as much as it confused her. For several long moments, they were caught in a strange dance, he looking towards the forest with a quiet wonder, and she hiding just beyond the trees, watching him with growing curiosity. Mma could feel the pull, the urge to step forward, to reach out again, despite the pain of their last meeting. She was drawn to him, not just because he was one of the villagers she had always wanted to understand, but because he seemed familiar in ways she couldn't quite explain. Just as Mma was about to retreat deeper into the woods, Ifani spoke, his voice barely more than a whisper. Are you there? Mma froze, her breath caught in her throat. He was talking to her, or at least, he was talking to the forest, hoping she was listening. I don't know if you can hear me, Ifani continued, his voice heavy with something Mma couldn't yet name, guilt, maybe, or regret. But I want to thank you. You saved me that day. I was a fool to repay you with fear. Mma's heart skipped a beat. He was thanking her. The man who had attacked her was now standing at the edge of the forest, offering words of gratitude. She took a step closer, staying just out of sight, her mind racing. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected him to return, let alone seek her out. I don't know who you are, Ifani continued, his voice growing quieter, almost pained. But I owe you my life. I don't understand why you saved me, why you didn't leave me to die in the forest. Mma felt a surge of emotion, a mix of relief and confusion. She had saved him because it was the right thing to do, because it was in her nature to help, not hurt. But his words now felt heavy, as if there was more behind them than just gratitude. I, Ifani's voice cracked. He seemed to falter for a moment, as if wrestling with something deep inside her. I once left someone in the forest a long time ago, someone I should have protected. Ma leaned forward, her eyes wide, trying to catch every word. Who was he talking about? Someone he had left in the forest? Was that why he felt such guilt? His voice grew quieter still. I don't know if she survived. I don't know if my daughter survived. Ma's heart skipped a beat. He was talking about his daughter, someone he had left in the forest. But why? Who was his daughter? And why did he feel such guilt over abandoning her? Ma's mind raced, piecing together fragments of the man's words. But the picture they painted was incomplete. She had always known Ijoma wasn't her birth mother. Ijoma had told her that much when she was old enough to understand that she had been found, abandoned in the forest as a baby. Mma had never questioned it. The forest had always been her home, and the idea of another life, another family, felt distant and unreal to her. But now, as she listened to the man speak of a daughter he had left in the forest, Mma couldn't shake the feeling that there was a connection. Could it be that the man's daughter had been abandoned in the same way she had? But if that were true, why did she feel this strange pull towards him? What was it about him that stirred something deep inside her, something she couldn't yet name? The more she thought about it, the more confused she became. The man's sorrow was real, his regret palpable, but she couldn't make sense of it. All she knew was that his story had touched something in her, a place she had never really explored. He spoke of guilt, of abandoning a child he should have protected, and for reasons Mma couldn't fully explain. Those words struck her deeply. She had always wondered about the life she had been born into, but the forest and the people she knew here had always seemed like enough. Now, she wasn't so sure, but she still didn't know who she really was or where she had come from. The man's words only added to the mystery that already surrounded her life. I'm sorry, Ifani whispered into the forest, for everything. Mma's chest tightened with emotion, but she stayed hidden, unsure of how to respond or whether she even should. She wasn't ready to reveal herself, not to this man whose words confused her and stirred questions she wasn't ready to ask. She had no idea what he would say or do if he saw her again, and the fear of being rejected or misunderstood once more held her back. As if Annie turned and walked slowly back towards the village, Mma remained in the shadows, her heart heavy with uncertainty. She didn't know who this man was or why he seemed so familiar, but something told her that this story was important, perhaps even tied to her own in ways she didn't yet understand. When she returned to Ijoma's hut later that evening, her thoughts were still spinning. Ijoma, who had been waiting for her by the fire, looked up and saw the turmoil in Mma's eyes. You have learned something, Ijoma said quietly, setting down her work. Mma nodded, sitting down beside her. She felt the warmth of the fire on her skin, but inside she was cold. I I saw him again, Mma said, her voice trembling slightly. The man I saved. He came back to the forest. Ijoma's gaze softened, and she waited for Mma to continue. He he was talking to me, even though he didn't know I was there, Mma said. He was talking about someone, his daughter, the one he abandoned in the forest. Ijoma's eyes flickered with understanding, but she remained silent, letting Mma process her thoughts. He feels so much guilt, Mma whispered, her voice tight with emotion. He said he doesn't know if she survived. But why would someone abandon their daughter in the forest? It doesn't make sense. Ijoma reached out and gently placed a hand on Mma's arm. Her touch, steady and comforting. There are many things in this world that don't make sense, child. People are driven by fear and superstition, by forces we cannot always understand. But you are here now, and you have grown strong. Mma swallowed hard, her mind still racing. But what if his daughter is like me? What if she was left behind, like I was? Or, Mma gasped, is it possible I am his daughter? She asked, looking at Ijoma with wide eye, the possibility growing on her. Ijoma's grip on Mma's arm tightened slightly, her voice firm but kind. You cannot know, Mma. There are many stories of those who have been abandoned or lost. But you have to trust in what you do know. You are here now, and you are more than the sum of anyone's mistakes. Mma wiped her tears, her heart still heavy, but steadied by Ijoma's words. She wasn't ready to face the man again, not until she understood more about herself. For now, she would try to hold on to the strength Ijoma had taught her. But for the first time, she felt a flicker of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, she could find the answers she sought. For now, though she would wait, she would be cautious, just as Ijoma had taught her. But one day, she would step out of the shadows and into the light of the truth. The days that followed were quiet, but inside, Mma felt a storm building. She couldn't stop thinking about the man, the father who had spoken of abandoning his daughter, the same man who had struck her in fear, yet returned to the forest filled with regret. His words echoed in her mind, stirring questions she had never thought to ask before. Who was she? Where had she come from? And why did the man's story resonate so deeply with her? In the village, Ifeanyi too was wrestling with his emotion. He had been haunted by the memory of the wild girl who had saved him. He couldn't explain why she had left such a deep impression on him, but there was something about her that he couldn't shake, which is why he kept going back, and he hopes that one day his efforts will yield a good result because he always felt her presence each time he returned to the edge of the forest. Every day, as he went about his work, he found himself looking towards the forest, wondering if the girl was still out there, hiding among the trees. He felt drawn to her, though he couldn't fully explain why. Perhaps it was the guilt he carried, the guilt of abandoning his own child, that made him feel connected to the wild girl. Or perhaps it was something deeper, something more primal, that tugged at his soul whenever he thought of her. He had shared his burden with the forest, confessing his sins to the wind and the trees. But he knew that wasn't enough. The guilt still gnawed at him, relentless and unforgiving. He had come to realize that he could not simply live with the memory of what had happened. He had to make amends, if that was even possible. And so, one afternoon, unable to bear the weight of his thoughts any longer, Ifani made his way back to the edge of the forest. This time, he came not as a man seeking forgiveness from unseen forces, but as someone determined to find answers. Mma had been sitting at the edge of the forest again, watching the village from a distance. She hadn't ventured any closer. Ifeanyi was walking towards the forest, his steps purposeful, but his expression conflicted. Mma's heart raced. She wasn't sure whether to hide or reveal herself, but something kept her rooted to the spot, watching him as he approached. He stopped at the edge of the forest, just as he had done before, but this time he didn't speak to the trees. Instead, he looked directly into the shadowy depths of the forest, as if searching for something, someone. Mma's breath caught in her throat. He was looking for her. She could feel it. Her mind whirled with uncertainty. Should she step forward? Should she confront him? There were so many questions she wanted to ask, so many things she didn't understand, but fear held her back. What if he reacted with violence again? What if he didn't want to know her? But then, to her surprise, Ifan spoke, his voice calm but heavy with emotion. I don't know if you can hear me, he said, his eyes scanning the forest. But I came back. I came back because I need to understand. Ma's heart pounded. She took a tentative step forward, still hiding among the trees, but close enough now to hear every word. I don't know who you are, but you saved me. You could have left me, but you didn't, and I can't stop thinking about why. Mma stayed silent, her breath shallow, her mind racing. She had saved him because it was the right thing to do, because it was in her nature to help, but she had never expected him to come back again and again to seek her out like this. Ifeanyi paused, his expression tightening with a mix of regret and sorrow. I left someone behind once, someone I should have protected, and I have carried that guilt with me ever since. When I saw you, something in me stirred. You reminded me of her. Mma's heart clenched. He was speaking of the daughter he had abandoned. The connection between his words and her own life felt too close, too real. But still, she couldn't step forward. She wasn't ready. I don't know if you are her or if you are someone else. Ifeanyi continued, his voice growing quieter. But I need to make things right. Even if you are not the one I lost, I need to understand why you saved me, why you showed me kindness when I showed you fear. Mma's chest tightened, her emotions swelling. She had saved him because she believed in doing what was right, not because of who he was. But his words, his pain, his guilt, they touched something deep inside her, something that had been dormant for so long. I don't expect forgiveness, Ifani whispered, his voice breaking slightly. I just need to know the truth. Mma took another step forward, her heart pounding in her ears. She wasn't sure if she was ready to face him, but the pull to understand was stronger than her fear. She wanted to know why his words resonated so deeply with her. She wanted to understand her own story, her own connection to the forest and the village beyond. But just as she was about to step into the light, a rustling sound from deeper within the forest startled her. She froze, her eyes darting towards the source of the noise. It was Ijoma. Ijoma, Mma whispered, her voice trembling. Ijoma placed a hand on Mma's arm, gently but firm. She turned to Ifeanyi, her gaze unwavering. You seek the truth, she said, her voice clear and steady. But the truth is not something you find easily. It must be earned. Ifeanyi's brow furrowed, confusion and determination wearing on his face. What do you mean? Ijoma stepped forward, her presence commanding. This girl you seek, I believe Mma here might be tied to her. Ijoma's presence seemed to calm the tension in the air, but the weight of her words hung heavy between them. Mma stood still, her heart racing, torn between her curiosity and the fear that had been growing since her encounter with Ifani. There was something deeper at play here, something that went beyond the man's guilt, beyond her own questions. Ifani, his eyes still fixed on Ijoma, spoke again, his voice low but steady. You said her life is tied to mine. How? Ijoma's gaze flickered towards Uma before turning to Ifeanyi. There was a brief silence, as if she was weighing her next words carefully. Finally, she spoke. You abandoned your daughter in the forest many years ago, didn't you? Ijoma's voice was quiet, but her words hit like a stone dropped into still water. Ifeanyi's face darkened with pain and regret, but he nodded slowly. Yes, it was a long time ago, but I have never forgotten. I was pressured by the villagers. They said she was cursed, born on a moonless night under the cries of owls. I gave in to my fear and left her there to die. Mma's breath caught in her throat. The moonless night? The cries of owls. These were the details Ijoma had once told her about the night she had been found as a baby. A cold shiver ran down her spine, and she glanced at Ijoma, her eyes wide with sudden realization. Ijoma's face softened, but there was no hesitation in her next words. That was the night I found Uma. Ifeanyi's eyes widened in shock, his breath catching in his throat. His gaze darted to Uma, who stood frozen, disbelief and confusion etched on her face. What? Ifeanyi whispered, his voice barely audible. Ijoma nodded solemnly. I found her that very night, abandoned in the forest, just as you said. She was crying, left alone to the element. I couldn't leave her there. So I took her in and raised her as my own. So, this is your daughter. The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Ma felt as though the ground beneath her had shifted, throwing her off balance. Her heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing to process what she had just heard. This man, this stranger, who had struck her in fear, was her father. Ifani staggered back, his face pale with shock and disbelief. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His hands trembled as he tried to make sense of what Ijoma had just told him. Mma, he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. You are my daughter. Mma recoiled slightly, her mind a storm of conflicting emotions. For so long, she had been curious about the villagers, about where she had come from, but now that the truth had come laid before her, she didn't know how to feel. This man, her father, had abandoned her in the forest, left her to die because of fear and superstition. He had cast her aside, and now, after all these years, he wanted to claim her. The pain and confusion welled up inside her, threatening to spill over. No, Mma whispered, shaking her head as she took a step back. You are not, and I'm not your daughter. Ifani's face crumbled in anguish. Ma, please. I don't know. I didn't. You left me. Mma's voice trembled, her eyes brimming with tears. You abandoned me in the forest like I was nothing. You didn't even try to find me. You just, you just left me. The raw emotion in her voice struck Ifani like a blow, and he dropped to his knees, his hands reaching out in desperation. I know I did. I know I failed you, but please, I didn't know you had survived. I thought I was doing what I had to, what the villagers told me was right, but I was wrong. I have regretted it every day of my life. Mma shook her head, her tears spilling over. She has spent so many years wondering about her origins, feeling the pull towards the village. But now that the truth was in front of her, it was too much. How could she reconcile with the man in front of her, with the father she had dreamed of, the one she had hoped might still want her? You don't know me, Mma said, her voice tight with pain. You left me. Ijoma is the one who raised me, not you. Ifani's shoulders slumped, his hands falling to the ground in defeat. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, he said, his voice hoarse. But I want to know you, Ma. I want to make things right, if you will let me. Mma's chest tightened with a mixture of anger, sadness, and confusion. She had wanted to understand the villagers, to find her place in the world. But now that the truth was before her, it felt too heavy, too painful. I don't know if I can forgive you, Mma whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't know if I even want to. Ifani's face crumbled with grief, his tears flowing freely now. He has spent years living with the guilt of abandoning his daughter. And now that she stood before him, the pain of his actions was too much to bear. Ijoma stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. Mma, I know this is hard. I know this is not what you expected. But this man is your father. And he is here now. The choice is yours. But you must decide whether you will allow him into your life or whether you will let the past keep you apart. Mma looked from Ijoma to Ifani, her mind spinning. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know how to feel. Part of her still longed for the connection she had once craved, the understanding she had sought from the village. But another part of her, the part that had been hurt, the part that had lived with the knowledge of being abandoned, couldn't let go of the pain. I need time, Mma finally said, her voice trembling. I can't. I can't do this right now. Ifeanyi nodded, though his face was filled with sorrow. Take all the time you need, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I will wait. I will be here whenever you are ready. Mma turned away, tears streaming down her face. She couldn't look at him, not now. She had spent so long imagining what her life might have been like, but the reality was too painful to bear. She needed space. She needed to think. Ijeoma, her face filled with quiet understanding, placed a hand on Mma's shoulder. Come, child, she said softly. Let's go home. Mma nodded, her body numb with emotion. Together, they turned and walked back into the forest, leaving Ifani kneeling on the ground, broken and alone. As they disappeared into the trees, Mma's heart ached with the weight of the revelation. She had wanted answers, but now that she had them, she wasn't sure if she could accept them. The truth, it seemed, was more complicated than she had ever imagined. The days following the revelation were quiet. Mma kept to herself, her heart heavy with the weight of her newfound identity. She couldn't bring herself to speak of it, not to Ijoma, not to the others who had raised her, and certainly not to Ifine. The pain of being abandoned still burned deep within her, and despite her earlier curiosity, the truth of her origins felt more like a burden than an answer. Ifeanyi, on the other hand, spent his days waiting for a sign that Mma would be willing to speak with him, to begin the process of healing. He knew he had no right to demand anything from her. The hurt he had caused was too great to simply be erased. Still, he lingered at the edge of the village, always keeping an eye on the forest, always hoping for a chance to see her again. Ijeoma, ever the pillar of strength in Mma's life, gave her space but remained close by. She had always known this day might come, the day when Mma would have to confront her past. Though it pained her to see Mma struggle, she trusted the girl she had raised to find her own path. Ijeoma had given her the tools to navigate life's most difficult questions. But this journey, the journey of reconciling with her true identity, was one Mma had to take on her own. Weeks passed, and Mma's emotions continued to churn. The anger she felt towards Ifani was still sharp, but it had dulled slightly with time. She couldn't deny the ache in her heart, the desire to know him, to understand why he had done what he did. And yet, the thought of forgiving him, of accepting him as her father, seemed impossible. How could she reconcile with the man who had abandoned her, with the man who now waited, full of sorrow and regret? One evening, as the sun began to set and the forest was bathed in a soft golden light, Mma found herself walking back towards the edge of the trees. She hadn't planned to go there, but her feet seemed to lead her of their own accord. She stood at the boundary between the forest and the village, her heart pounding as memories of her last encounter with Ifani surfaced. To her surprise, he was there, sitting on a fallen log, his face turned towards the forest as if he had been waiting for her all along. His shoulders were slumped, his expression weary, but there was a quiet determination in his eyes when he saw her approach. Mma, he said softly, his voice carrying both hope and sorrow. Mma stood still, her emotions swelling inside her. She didn't know what to say, but she knew that she couldn't avoid this moment any longer. Slowly, she stepped forward, closing the distance between them. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words. But Mma could feel something beginning to shift. I'm still angry, Mma finally said, her voice trembling. I'm still hurt. Ifeanyi nodded, his face filled with understanding. I know, he said quietly, and you have every right to be. I don't know if I can ever forgive you for what you did, Mma continued, her voice brimming with unshed tears. You left me. You didn't even try to come back for me. Ifani's face crumpled with pain, but he didn't argue. You are right, he whispered. I didn't, and I have regretted it every day since. But I didn't come here expecting your forgiveness. I came here because I want you to know that I'm sorry. Truly, I can't undo what I did, but I want to be part of your life if you will let me. Mma's chest tightened.
She had longed for this connection, for answers about her past. But now that it was in front of her, it felt more complicated than she had imagined. She had a father, one who had abandoned her, but now wanted to make amends. She had Ijoma, the woman who had raised her with love and care, the only mother she had ever known. How could she reconcile these two worlds? I don't know if I can call you my father, Mma said after a long pause. Not yet, but I think I would like to get to know you, to try at least. A flicker of hope crossed Ifani's face. That's all I ask for, he said, his voice filled with gratitude. I'm willing to wait as long as you need. Mma nodded, her heart still heavy but a little lighter now that she has spoken her truth. She wasn't ready to forgive him fully, but she was willing to give him a chance. It would take time, perhaps a long time, but she realized now that healing was a process, not something that could happen all at once. In the weeks that followed, Mma and Ifani began to meet. Their conversations were slow and tentative at first, filled with awkward silences and hesitant questions, but gradually they began to open up to one another. Ifani told stories about her mother, the woman he had loved and lost, and the village where Mma had been born. He spoke of the regret that had weighed on him for years, and Mma in turn shared what it had been like to grow up in the forest under Ijoma's care. It wasn't an easy process. There were still moments of tension, still wounds that hadn't fully healed. But slowly, Mma began to see Ifeanyi not as the man who had abandoned her, but as someone who had made a terrible mistake and was trying to atone for it. Through it all, Ijoma remained a steady presence in Mma's life. Though she had never asked Mma to choose between her and Nefani, Mma often felt torn between the two. But over time, she realized that she didn't have to choose. Ijoma was the woman who had raised her, who had given her love and protection when no one else would. She would always be her mother in the truest sense of the word, no matter what. One day, Azuma sat with Ijoma by the fire. She spoke of her journey with Ifeanyi. I don't know if I will ever fully forgive him, she admitted, but I'm starting to understand him, and maybe that's enough for now. Ijoma smiled gently, her eyes filled with pride. Forgiveness is a gift, child, she said softly. It doesn't come all at once, but understanding, that's the first step, and it sounds like you have already taken it. Mma nodded, her heart feeling lighter than it had been in a long time. She had found her answers, though they hadn't come in the way she had expected. She had found her father, and though their relationship was far from perfect, it was beginning to heal. She had Ijoma, the woman who had given her everything, and she had herself, strong, resilient, and more sure of who she was than ever before. The days turned into weeks, and the story of Ifanya and Mma quietly began to spread throughout the village. At first, it was just whispers, rumors about the man who had once abandoned his daughter in the forest and was now seeking her forgiveness. But as more people learned of the truth, something unexpected happened. Instead of the unusual gossip and judgment, there was a shift in the villagers' attitude. The fear and superstition that had once ruled their hearts began to give way to something else, understanding. The villagers had long held onto the belief that the forest was a place of evil, and that those who lived on its fringes were cursed or mad. They had cast out Ijoma and others like her, branding them as dangerous, untouchable. But Ifani's story and the revelation that his daughter had survived all those years under Ijoma's care forced them to confront their own fears and prejudice. If Mma, who had been born in the village, had been raised by those they considered mad and had thrived,
What did that say about the outcast? Were they really to be feared, or had the village simply misunderstood them all along? It didn't happen overnight, but gradually the villagers began to question the stories they had told themselves for so long. They began to see that the people who lived on the outskirts and the forest were not monsters or spirits, but people like them, who had been cast out for reasons that no longer seemed just. One afternoon, as Ifeanyi and Mma were walking together near the village, an elder approached them. He was an old man, his back bent with the weight of years, but his eyes were sharp with curiosity. I have heard the story, the elder said, his voice low but clear, of how you found your daughter again, of how she was raised by the forest people. Ifeanyi nodded, his heart pounding slightly. He had been prepared for judgment. But the elder's tone was not accusatory. It was thoughtful. I have lived many years, the elder continued, and I have seen how fear can blind us. We have been afraid of the forest and its people for as long as I can remember. But your daughter, she's proof that we are wrong. The outcasts are not evil. They are not cursed. They are just people. Mma, standing beside her father, felt a warmth spread through her chest. The elder's words were simple, but they carried a weight of change. If someone like Mma can be raised by them and grow strong, then maybe we have been wrong about a lot of things. The elder said, his gaze distant, as if contemplating the years of fear and exclusion that had shaped the village. Ifeanyi bowed his head in gratitude. Thank you for seeing that, he said softly. It has taken me a long time to see it myself. Word of the elder's change of heart spread, and slowly more villagers began to speak out. Some were hesitant, clinging to old beliefs, but others, especially those who had heard Ifani's story, began to question the way the outcasts had been treated for so long. One day, a small group of villagers made their way to the edge of the forest, where Ijoma and the other outcasts lived. It was a moment of great tension, as the outcasts had long grown used to being avoided or feared. But this time was different. The villagers, led by the elder, came not with fear or hatred, but with open hands. We have come to learn, the elder said, his voice humble. We have come to see you as you are, not as we have imagined you to be. Ijoma, who had stood at the center of the outcast community for so long, watched them approach with a calm but cautious gaze. She had known this day might come, but she had never been sure when or how it would arrive. She stepped forward, meeting the elder's eyes, her voice steady. You are welcome to see, Ijoma said. We have nothing to hide. The villagers, unsure at first, slowly began to interact with the outcasts. They learned that those who lived on the outskirts were not cursed, not touched by spirits, but were simply people who had been rejected for reasons as varied as illness, old age, or simply being different. They saw how the outcasts lived in harmony with the forest, how they used herbs and natural remedies to heal, how they shared their knowledge and cared for one another in ways the village had long ignored. Over time, the village's relationship with the forest outcasts began to change. The outcasts were no longer feared but respected for their knowledge and kindness. Though they didn't fully integrate into the village, many of them preferred the life they had built in the forest. They were no longer shunned. Slowly, they began to be invited to village gatherings, asked for their wisdom on matters of healing and nature, and treated as equals, not outcasts. Mma, who had once felt torn between the world of the forest and the world of the village, found peace in the fact that both could now coexist. She continued to build her relationship with Ifeanyi, learning more about the family she had come from, while still cherishing the bond she had with Ijoma and the outcast who had raised her. Ifeanyi, for his part, became an advocate for change in the village. He spoke openly about his mistakes, about how fear had led him to abandon his daughter, and about the importance of seeing people for who they truly were, not for what superstition or tradition dictated. His story became a lesson to the villagers, one that reminded them of the dangers of fear and the power of understanding. The village, once divided by fear and prejudice, began to heal. And though there were still challenges, still moments of tension, the story of Ifeanyi, Mma, and Ijoma served as a reminder of what could be achieved when people were willing to listen, to understand, and to change. In the end, the story of Mma, Ifeanyi, and Ijoma became more than just a tale of family and reconciliation. It became a story of the village itself, a story of growth, of learning to see beyond fear, and of finding a way to bridge the divide that had once seemed so insurmountable. Mma, standing at the edge of the forest one evening, looked out at the village that had once seemed so distant, so unreachable. Now, it was a place where both the people of the forest and the people of the village could coexist, if not fully together, then at least with mutual respect. She had found her place in both worlds, and in doing so, had helped to build a bridge between them. The lessons of their story were clear. Fear can blind, but understanding can heal. Superstition can divide, but love can bring people back together. And no matter how broken a relationship may seem, there is always a chance for redemption, for forgiveness, and for change. And so, with the forest behind her and the village ahead, Mma walked forward into a future where both parts of her identity, forest and village, outcast and daughter, could finally coexist in peace. Their story continued, one of reconciliation, growth, and the slow, steady process of learning to live with both the past and the future. Thank you so much for watching this amazing story on African Stories. If you liked it and felt inspired, please show your support by clicking the like button, sharing with your friends, and leaving a comment below. To see more interesting stories and learn about different cultures, subscribe to African Stories and don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Your support means a lot and helps us bring more stories to you. Until we meet again, stay connected, stay inspired, and keep smiling.